for the planet is taking place in a time of crisis. Over the past year, the pandemic has restricted our freedom of movement, damaged our economies, our societies, and claimed over 2.2 million. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, artificial intelligence powers biodiversity conservation. Nature's practitioners work by providing real-time solutions to ecological problems, combined with a firm human commitment to the same goal. These technological tools and services could hold the key to reversing the deterioration of global ecosystems. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am Shamila Nayab, the Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences at UNESCO in Paris. The conference on artificial intelligence for the planet is taking place in a time of crisis. Over the past year, the pandemic has restricted our freedom of movement, damaged our economies, our societies, and claimed over 2.2 million human lives. It didn't have to be this way. As Dr. Peter Daszak observed recently, there is no great mystery about the cause of the COVID pandemic or of any modern pandemic. The same human activities that drive climate change and biodiversity loss also drive pandemic risk through the impact on our environment. Changes in the way we use land, in the way we disrupt nature, in the way we interact with nature, in the way we appreciate nature, and increase contact between wildlife, livestock, pathogens, and people are really the causes for these types of pandemics. Dr. Daszak is one of the authors of an expert report released a few months ago by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This body, which is known as IPBES for short, really conducts regular assessments of the status of biodiversity and the ecosystems that sustain life on Earth. This platform is co-sponsored by member states, by UNESCO, by UNEP, FAO, and UNDP. The IPBES observes in its latest report that 70% of emerging diseases such as the Ebola, the Zika virus, and all other known pandemics, including influenza, HIV/AIDS, and COVID-19, are really caused by microbes of animal origin. So how do they get to humans? Well, they spill over when humans and livestock come into contact with each other. This is through agricultural expansion, deforestation, wildlife trade. This is when we break the fine divide and the fine equilibrium that separates these ecosystems that normally would live in harmony with each other. Dear colleagues, the pandemic has shone the light on interdependencies between humans and other species. It has reminded us that when we destroy the primary forest, or we indulge in wildlife trade, or we break this barrier that separates the ecosystems, we are increasing our own vulnerability. High biodiversity manages to buffer some of the negative effects of infectious diseases. As we lose the biodiversity, we are losing the alternative host for vectors of diseases to infect, and making it more likely that those pathogens will then infect human beings. The IPBES report estimates that another 1.7 million currently undiscovered viruses in mammals and birds, of which up to half could have the ability to infect people. So at present, the focus is on containing and controlling the diseases after emerge, such as through vaccines. But we need to focus upstream. We need to focus on preventing those pandemics. And one way to do that is to preserve a high biological diversity of our planet. And we have the science, technology, and innovation to be able to do so. This involves different ways to manage ecosystems, to restore natural habitats. We need to monitor biodiversity on a wider scale. However, the monitoring means collecting and analyzing vast quantities of data over large distances and on long time scales. And this work is very labor intensive. It is costly, but there is a solution. Artificial intelligence. It can reduce the time, effort needed to monitor the biodiversity. For example, motion sensor cameras can be used in natural habitats to gather vast quantities of data on the biodiversity inexpensively and unobtrusively. It used to be time consuming previously to analyze all the images recorded, but today we can analyze 3.2 million images in the snapshot Serengeti dataset in Africa. So artificial intelligence can automate identification of over 99% of the images of animals. These motion sensor cameras are currently also used in UNESCO's over 2,000 designated sites. UNESCO is home to the unique global network of biosphere reserves. These are reserves where we protect nature, we restore nature, and people live in harmony with nature. These UNESCO biosphere reserves are models of sustainable development, demonstrating that it is possible to live in harmony with nature and restore nature. Major cities are also found in UNESCO's biosphere reserves. This is the sustainable approach to agriculture, to tourism, and environmental friendly technologies. The idea is to help communities to reconnect with nature and to develop healthier relationships with nature. The ultimate aim is to build more resilient societies by protecting and restoring nature. These 700 biosphere reserves in over 129 countries are really the models of the coalition with nature that UNESCO, through its education, science, culture, and communication, is promoting. Now, in these biosphere reserves, we are able to demonstrate the use of artificial intelligence and other technologies to monitor wildlife, to monitor biodiversity changes over large areas. We are able to monitor ecological patterns and the processes very widely and across the world by using satellite imagery to gain an impression of habitat heterogeneity over large areas, to monitor the biodiversity, and to even deploy camera traps in combination of locations to monitor the biodiversity and illegal wildlife trade. This approach works, and recent studies have shown that we are even able to monitor migrating wildebeest. And the study has shown that deep learning algorithms were able to count all of the wildebeest within hours compared to weeks for traditional counting techniques. Dear colleagues, we all learn about drones today. Well, drones are also equipped with artificial intelligence, and they are being used in UNESCO's Biosphere Reserve for planning and monitoring land use. In the Wundalinchi Biosphere Reserve in China, we are using three-dimensional models of the images collected by drones to monitor biodiversity. In Mount Nimba Biosphere Reserve in Guinea, UNESCO working with Kyoto University in Japan to use drones to monitor the land use and changes in vegetation cover. And in Central Africa, we are monitoring the great apes to ensure the great ape survival. So I'd like to stress, however, that technology alone is not sufficient to protect biodiversity. Whereas we need artificial intelligence, it will also take a cultural shift. The time for contemplation is over. Biodiversity is shrinking at an alarming rate. We must act. We must use the best of technologies available and make sure that the world across has access to science, technology, and innovation. We must reduce the knowledge gap and empower all countries to have access to artificial intelligence to protect our planet, our global planet. This is why UNESCO is promoting the concept of open science, and UNESCO is mandated by its member states to develop a recommendation on open science so that data can be shared freely and openly across the world to ensure that no one is left behind. The time is now. We need to act. Last year's Biodiversity Summit, organized by the United Nations global leaders in New York, called for a commitment by all leaders to an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. This was an unprecedented gesture. It is not too late to change. We need to have access to science, technology, innovation. We need to use artificial intelligence to monitor planet Earth, not only for today, but for future generations. But we must act. We must act now. We need science. We need more and better science, but we need people to have access to that science. People across the world need to share in all the scientific discoveries. Thank you very much.
More than 2,000 satellites stream data every second. We've generated more data in the last 2 years than in all of human history. But are we using this data to make better decisions on the ground, to solve our most pressing environmental challenges? AI can help us do just that. I'm Jamison Irvin from the United Nations Development Program, and I'd like to share a project we're working on called the UN Biodiversity Lab, Mapping Nature for Sustainable Development. Let's say that you care about sustainable development, and in particular, water security. And let's say that you care about this in the context of Tanzania, a country that has high levels of water insecurity and whose water depends on land use and land cover. You could begin by mapping the water catchment area of Dar es Salaam. You could look at forest cover. You could look at forest cover change in the last 20 years, or you could look at protected areas. But how do you combine all of this information to get a real snapshot of what's happening? That's where the UN Biodiversity Lab comes in. This facility enables users to look at things like water catchment area, forest cover, forest loss, protected areas, and more than 200 other data layers to look at new and novel insights about things like water security. So in this case, we can look at the hydroshed of Dar es Salaam and see where is water storage important. We can look at where forests need to be restored. We can look at where we need to protect and manage intact forests and where we can improve management of protected areas. But what if you want a map that tells you where to protect, manage, and restore nature to achieve all of your nature-dependent goals on an annual basis? You need three things. First, you need great data on not just water catchment and on carbon, or threatened species, or even cattle density. You need a wide range of data to help answer how can nature help you achieve your development goals. Secondly, you need the facility like the UN Biodiversity Lab that lets you put these data together in a non-GIS environment and come with new insights. But third, you need AI. AI-powered land cover mapping is essential. A number of projects are using AI to map land cover at 10-meter resolution pixels globally using publicly available satellite imagery. And this enables us to have higher spatial resolution and more timely maps, even on an annual basis, of how the Earth's surface is changing. AI-powered monitoring can help us look at biomass carbon by combining AI-generated land use and land cover maps with biomass carbon density models to produce a dynamic map for carbon monitoring. We can use AI-powered monitoring of biodiversity to look at combining land use and land cover change with biodiversity intactness and gaining insight. We can combine AI-generated land use and land cover maps with human footprint to show a dynamic map of how the Earth is changing. And we can even look within cityscapes, harnessing the power of AI to map land use within urban areas to enable smart urban planning. But what if we want to take a step beyond that? At UNDP, we're helping governments and others map essential life support areas. This means that governments can dial up and dial down different values depending on their own national goals. In the case of Costa Rica, for example, they can use AI-generated land cover maps overlaid with biodiversity intactness, carbon, human footprint, protected areas, and any other layers that make sense for Costa Rica. And using that facility, Costa Rica has developed a map of hope that shows the country where they need to protect nature, manage sustainably, and restore ecosystems in order to achieve their nature-dependent development goals. They're also looking at how forests and urban trees can help cool cities within Costa Rica. Now that's cool. Coming in March 2021, we are launching the UN Biodiversity Lab 2.0. This has some features, for example, that allows any user to identify a country, to understand the dynamic summary metrics that are happening within that country, to visualize data trends over time, and to spatially map the trends geospatially. UN Biodiversity Lab 2.0 will also have analytics that show, for example, how well does the protected area estate capture carbon. This facility also allows governments to use the data for analytics to map how they're doing, for example, on protected area intactness, to monitor targets and indicators at a national level. And it also provides a facility for organizations such as the Convention on Biological Diversity to use these data to inform reports such as the Global Biodiversity Outlook. I'm Jameson Irvin with UNDP, and stay tuned to learn more about the UN Biodiversity Lab, AI, and mapping of essential life support areas.
Hi, I'm Tanya Berger-Wolf, director and co-founder of WildBook at WildMe, and I'm here with a team of WildMe. We're losing biodiversity at an unprecedented scale. And the problem is, we don't even have the basic data. The International Unit of Conservation of Nature that tracks the conservation status of the endangered species of the world and determines whether they're endangered, critically endangered, or protected, doesn't have this data on even the basic information on more than a third of its species. And these are iconic species, killer whales and polar bears. How fast does the population of African elephants decline? How far do the whales travel? And how many juvenile turtles survive to adulthood? These are the data that are critical to making conservation decisions that work. We cannot put enough GPS collars and satellite tags to track all the animals everywhere all over the world. Besides, those can be dangerous to the animals themselves. So how do we get the information that we need? Artificial intelligence to the rescue. Today, the most abundant, readily available source of information about anything, including wildlife, are images. Pictures and videos coming from scientists, field assistants, camera traps, as well as tourists going on vacations and posting their photos and videos on social media. There are millions of images about animals out there. And we built a system that can take all of those millions of images and, using modern machine learning, identify which ones contain animals, where the animals are in those pictures, and determine not only the species, but recognize down to individual animal. Zippy the zebra, and Joe the giraffe, and Willie the whale, and Terry the turtle, using the unique markings on the animal body, like a fingerprint, or even the shape of a whale's fluke or the dorsal fin of a dolphin. With information on when and where the image was taken, we can now track the animals non-invasively without putting GPS collars, count them, and even figure their social network. Each wild book contains that information about animals, as well as the map and all the scientists and conservation projects that have that specific animal in their data set, so they can collaborate and share data, and from the pixels of individual photographs to build a global view of the species. Wildbook for whales and dolphins contains millions of images on more than 45,000 individual animals. We even build an intelligent agent that can go over the publicly posted social media photos and videos and find the ones that contain animals of interest, identify the animals, figure out from the description and title when and where the video was taken, and add that information automatically to the appropriate wild book, posting then in the comments of the social media about the connection that was automatically identified and the animal that was added to Wildbook. And the most common response that we get from the users is, wow, this is amazing. How can I help? That democratizes science. That allows everyone to add, to contribute to science and conservation. Wildbook for whale sharks contains more than 12,000 identified individuals from photographs coming from almost 9,000 citizen scientists and more than 200 conservation and research projects, as well as one very intelligent agent that brings in videos and photographs of people who went on their vacation and didn't even know that they could contribute. That data also became the basis for International Unit of Conservation of Nature entry for whale shark, updating the population status, as well as the basis for the most comprehensive study on the biology of this endangered species, co-authored by 37 authors who met through the pages of Wildbook. We have 53 species represented in different Wildbooks today, that are identified using 7 ID algorithms, and more than 80 publications have been published using data from Wildbooks. Wildbook technology also enabled the first ever in history comprehensive census of the endangered gravy zebra, done by ordinary people driving around Kenya, where 95% of the species remain, just taking pictures for 2 days. From school kids and rangers to tourists with telephoto cameras, more than 40,000 images were taken, and every zebra was identified. That information became the basis for the most comprehensive species management program enacted by Kenya Wildlife Service, as well as the entry for IUCN red list gravy zebras. The information taken from social media adds to the knowledge for scientists and conservation managers. However, it is also useful, unfortunately, for wildlife criminals. Geotagged images of endangered species are pointers for poachers and other criminals. And Wildbook is highly aware of that danger. We not only build a secure system and protected system, we also work to raise awareness of this issue among all those who post their videos and photographs on social media, so that in the effort to protect the species, we do not accidentally cause its extinction. Artificial intelligence, citizen science, and everybody's efforts allow us to go from pixels to science, conservation, and public engagement at large scale and high resolution over time, space, and individuals, and everybody contributes. All you have to do is take a picture.
Hey there, I'm Max Nova. I'm one of the founders of Sylvia Terra. And at Sylvia Terra, we're using AI to unlock the full value of the planet's forests. We believe that measurements make markets, and by putting in place mechanisms to measure and pay for outcomes on the landscape, we can get the forests that our society so desperately needs. And so I'm excited to tell some of the work that we've been doing at the cutting edge of AI and machine learning to measure and value our planet's forests. So to begin with, just to set some context, we all know that forests are really valuable and provide all sorts of benefits to our societies, from the carbon sequestration and the climate impact that has, to habitat for wildlife and biodiversity and water. And there's plenty of things that we want less of in our forests too. Like we want less wildfire, we want less beetle infestations. And so there are all these values and outcomes that we want on the landscape. And historically, we have done a terrible job as a society of measuring and paying for those values. In fact, the only thing that we do a pretty reasonable job of measuring and paying for out of forests is timber. And that's because timber is really easy. You cut down a tree, you put it on a logging truck, and you literally drive it across a scale at a mill where you get paid by the ton. And it's easy for buyers and sellers to measure and quantify what's being transacted. And so everybody feels like they're getting a fair shake. All these other values from carbon and biodiversity and water and wildfire mitigation, all that stuff happens out in the woods where historically it's been really expensive and slow to measure what's even out there. And so that's the problem that we're solving at Sylvia Terra. And it couldn't be at a more important time because as we've seen, even just over the last year, a parade of corporations making these carbon pledges and net zero commitments. And so there's this unprecedented demand for high quality carbon credits. And so it's increasingly become clear, though, that there's a lot of issues with how legacy forest carbon projects are structured, and buyers are increasingly demanding transparent, accurate, data-driven, science-based carbon credits that come from forests, which are these very complicated systems. And so it's important to get the measurements right in order to make sure that we're creating real impact on the landscape. Because if we don't get this right, you end up with news articles like this, that we've seen coming out over the last year that are really raising questions about the way these legacy forest carbon projects are structured, along the axes of additionality, leakage, and permanence, all of these things that are critical to ensuring that we create real impact in our forests. And at Sylvia Terra, we saw all this. And as forest measurement experts, we've been helping big timber companies and conservation groups and state and federal agencies use satellite imagery to improve their forest management for over a decade now. We saw these problems and we said, well, we can do better with data. And so that's what we've been working on for the last couple of years. So this is a picture I'm really proud of. This is what we call Base Map. It's the first ever high resolution forest map of every acre of the United States. A couple of years ago, we were a grantee of the Microsoft AI for Earth program. And so we were able to scale up the work we had done to do the entire contiguous United States. And it was the first time anyone had ever created one of these high resolution forest maps of every acre. And so now we do this every single year. So at Sylvia Terra, we measure every acre of forest every year. And that enables us to start to really transform the way that natural capital markets work. And to sort of go a level deeper here, on Base Map, you start off with satellite imagery, and then we run our analytics and we transform that imagery into information. And what you're seeing here, this is a map of the number of trees across some of the Sierra Mountain Range in California. We can also break it out by individual tree species across the landscape. And the real power of this comes to when you zoom in on an individual property. And so this is a property in Alabama where we have a wall-to-wall map of all the trees on that property. And that's important because you can from that figure out not only how much carbon is in those trees, but also critically, how many tons of pulpwood, how many 2x4s, all of the stuff that really drives timber economics and real world forest management on the landscape today. And so at Sylvia Terra, we're moving beyond timber though into things like carbon. And so we're using our proprietary data to unlock a gigaton scale supply of new carbon removal opportunities and empowering businesses and landowners to all work together to help our planet and drive real climate action. And from the landowner side, it's pretty straightforward. They enroll their property, draw it on a map. We cookie cut it out of our data layer. They promise not to cut down their trees for a year. We measure at the beginning, we measure at the end, and we're able to pay for performance. If the landowner truly deferred their timber harvests, then they receive payment for that. And on the buyer side, this is from big corporations that are looking to buy carbon credits from landowners in their communities or in their supply chains. They simply, say where they would like to source those carbon credits from. We help connect them with landowners, and on the back end, Sylvia Terra is doing the measurement and the monitoring to ensure that all of these credits are transparent, accurate, data-driven, and science-based. And so we're able to sort of connect the dots between the corporations that have these commitments and the millions of landowners across hundreds of millions of acres that actually own the forests that can be an enormous tool in the fight against climate change. And so this is an enormous mission that we have at Sylvia Terra. We're starting with forest carbon in the United States, but like I tell our team all the time, ultimately, what we want to be doing is working with every landowner on every acre for every value every year, moving beyond timber, beyond carbon into things like biodiversity, wildfire mitigation, all of these values that happen out in our forests. And we think that if we get this right, if we can put in place a mechanism to measure and pay for value in our forests, we can double the value of the planet's forests by the year 2035. And we think that's a really important mission and one worth working really hard on. So that's what we're doing. And yeah, would be really excited to talk through any questions that anybody has in the Q&A. So looking forward to it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bistra Dilkina. I'm the co-director of the USC Center for AI in Society and an associate professor of computer science at the University of Southern California. I'm happy to be here today to share with you some of my work related to using AI for biodiversity conservation. And there's multiple ways in which AI can play a role. As you all know, habitat loss and fragmentation are key causes for biodiversity loss. In particular, we have seen a worldwide increase in urban land areas of more than 6 million hectares between 1970 and 2000. Deforestation has also destroyed a lot of habitat, with more than 5.2 million hectares per year lost between 2000 and 2010. Land conversion to cropland is also another way habitat is lost and fragmented. In these circumstances, maintaining landscape connectivity is critical to reduce inbreeding, increase genetic diversity, and provide ecosystems resilience. In fact, wildlife corridors are one conservation strategies people have identified for fighting that. But how do we decide where exactly to place these wildlife corridors in space in order to most effectively link core biological areas and allow animal movement? So we have worked on developing an AI tools that can help decision makers do exactly that, which takes into account spatially explicit habitat, the core areas where animals live, and heterogeneous costs across space, and develops a scalable algorithm that is able to propose where these corridors should be placed by searching through the exponential number of possible alternative decisions. With this kind of tool, decision makers are able to run the planning process for multiple budgets, for multiple different trade-offs between animal priorities for conservation, and create a systematic exploration of those trade-offs in order to make justifiable and informed conservation plans. And that's really key, being able to understand how small increases in the budget can result in large increases in biodiversity benefits, or when the marginal benefits are starting to taper off. In fact, this kind of AI aided decision tools can help in many other conservation and restoration decision-making under limited resources, such as, for example, strategically placing overpasses or making restoration actions. Another way in which we have leveraged AI for biodiversity conservation is using it in order to help efforts of stopping illegal wildlife poaching and wildlife trafficking. Illegal poaching threatens animal populations, biodiversity, and ecotourism. Even though 84% of elephants currently reside in protected areas, they are still observed to have an extremely high rate of mortality, with an elephant being slaughtered every 14 minutes. Without help, extinction is likely in 10 years. A primary way to combat poaching is by conducting patrols in these protected areas in trying to find and remove snares before they kill animals. What we can do is we can use historic data of patrolling efforts and observed poaching activity in parks, for example, when they are using tools like SMART, a spatial monitoring and reporting tool, to record this information, combine it with geospatial information such as distance to roads, animal counts, land cover, etc., to create machine learning models that can estimate the risk of finding snares in different parts of the park. With such information in hand, rangers can more strategically decide where to concentrate their efforts. And in fact, a tool like that has been developed. It's called PAUSE. This project in which I have been part of is led by Professor Milin Tambe at Harvard University. In field trial in Shrepok Wildlife Sanctuary in Cambodia, which spans 1,438 square miles, where rangers are trying to patrol to remove snares. in a 1 month of in December 2019, where they followed recommendations based on our AI tool, they were able to find 521 snares versus on average being able to find around 101 snares per month in the rest of 2018. And so these are really promising results of how this kind of machine learning and AI tools can help rangers in the field deploy their efforts more effectively. In addition to poaching in conservation areas, we need to try to stop the overall illicit wildlife trafficking supply network. In fact, illegal wildlife trade is estimated to have a retail value between 5 and 23 billion USD dollars annually. And it has a lot of different ways in which it harms our society. It's related to biological invasions and zoonotic diseases. It converges with other serious crimes. It undermines sustainable development investments. And so what can we do in order to try to prevent or disrupt these wildlife trafficking networks? In a current project, collaborating with several partners, including Professor Meredith Kaur at the University of Maryland, we're developing AI techniques that can help to infer spatially explicit supply chain networks. It can help predict likely trafficking routes, and it can help optimize interdiction efforts, such that we try to disrupt as much as possible the organized trafficking networks that are facilitating wildlife trafficking across the world. I look forward to your questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to this live Q&A session on AI as it intersects with nature and biodiversity conservation. I'm Nanjira Sambuli, who's going to be moderating this session with some of our speakers. And without much further ado, I'll just throw the first question to both of you, Max and Bistra, and you can go in that order, to just give us a quick recap in your views around what we should be placing a bit of hope on as far as AI goes, but also what should we not overhype as far as AI goes when it comes to nature and biodiversity. So one side of hope and then one side of hype. Max, over to you.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. And yeah, if you saw the prior presentations, I'm Max Nova. I'm one of the founders of Sylvia Terra. And yeah, I mean, we're very hopeful actually about many of the elements of AI, although mostly actually on the data input side. I mean, one of the things that's really remarkable over the last 5-10 years has been just a proliferation of new sensors going up, new platforms, all sorts of new imagery options for measuring and monitoring what's actually going on in the environment. So I think that's a really hopeful development. On the flip side, though, it's if we want to start changing people's behavior, the incentives really matter for landowners, the people that are actually where the rubber hits the road. And our view is that means we got to get the measurements right, we got to get the markets right for these things, and making sure that we have kind of financial grade information to drive real large scale transactions across the landscape at scale is that's a critical thing, and something that you got to make sure it's explainable at the end of the day when you start to transact real dollars. So that's one of the things that we've got our eye on for sure.
Sure. Thanks for that. Bistra, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So happy to be here. I'm Bistra Dilkina. I'm from the USC Center for AI in Society. And I have lots of hope for AI in terms of helping nature and biodiversity, because it can help us in multiple fronts. It can help us at the monitoring, at the gathering data, at finding insights that otherwise might remain hidden, because it's actually sometimes hard to recognize patterns that are interweaved in many different sources of information. And one area that I'm particularly excited about that is not machine learning, but is about using AI for decision making, helping in terms of allocating resources in the best way possible, studying different trade-offs, again, in the best way possible. And so I feel like AI has these two very important powers, predictive power and prescriptive power. Now, on the flip side, it's not a silver bullet, by itself, it's not going to solve anything. AI is a tool. So the first important thing is what goes in. If we need to make sure that we put representative data, that we are very aware of things that bad or noisy or imbalanced inputs can bring to our models. And then what comes out, a lot of the things that AI can bring to the table are really have to be treated as decision aids. They have to be put in the hands of the right people, domain experts, local experts, shareholders, which together in a conversation, bringing different perspectives, can decide how to best use these outcomes. For nature and biodiversity, and in many other areas, I think going the route of full AI automation is a dangerous one. And so I think that's the negative side that I can highlight.
Absolutely. And keeping that strain and coming back to Bistro and then back to Max, indeed, we're talking about nature, we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about things that should not essentially be that easily quantifiable, but essentially using tools like AI, machine learning, that essentially try to quantify everything around us. How do we, in a sense, square the circle around using AI in something as vast and truly diverse as our environment, really? What are your thoughts on that? How should we be framing the conversation on, if I will, quantifying or making sense of the unquantifiable that is our nature and biodiversity? So Bistro, I'll come to you first.
Yep, that's a very important point. I think one of the things is that's very important is to understand the values, the societal values behind nature and biodiversity, and understanding those, bringing, as I said, multiple stakeholders to the table, kind of having also a part of the work be also preference elicitation, value elicitation, understanding which are the important things is very important. The other part is the intersection between nature and humans, right? So often when we talk about biodiversity conservation, we also have to talk about the society around it, right? And how, for example, human-wildlife conflict or ecotourism in the areas where we're trying to protect biodiversity, and all of these things are so qualitative, they're so complex, right? And it's very important to keep the fact that numbers are very important, being able to have quantitative metrics of where things are, where they stand, where they can go in the future, but then also understanding that we have to talk about values, about impacts, about things that are not easily modeled in a system. It's just as an important part.
Thank you for that, Bistro. Max?
Yeah, I'd say that measurements really need to underpin almost any sort of science-based policy as we begin to think about these things. And it is also true that certain measurements are much easier than others. Above ground biomass estimates in forests are actually like pretty clear cut. I mean, that's something that people have been studying for a very long time, and you can actually see it. Whereas things that are more like soil carbon or some of these more complex, wildlife habitat metrics and things like that, that's a harder challenge, but also one that is completely worth doing. I think this is one of the grand challenges of our generation, is to figure out, how do we begin to quantify these things and really solve what, at least at Sylvia Terra, what we see as like this sort of planetary scale market failure, where we do a really terrible job of measuring and paying for almost all of the values in our planet's forests. Timber, there's an enormous market for timber, but that's because timber is easy. You cut down a tree and you roll it across the scale at a mill and you get paid by the ton. And it's easy for the buyers and sellers to quantify what's being transacted, and everybody feels like they're getting a fair deal. And so there's pretty good, market volume of transactions there. And markets are great when there's not market failure. And when markets are set up correctly, they're a very elegant way to sort of, do a reasonable resource allocation across, what are really complex real world systems. But the trouble is you got to get the measurements right. The measurements make markets here, and certain things like forest above ground biomass were much further along than some of these more complicated biodiversity or soil carbon or things like that. And so there should be a way to measure all of these things, and it's a question of how can we get measurements of the appropriate precision at an acceptable cost to drive the transactions of appropriate value. And there's a lot of moving parts there and a lot of work for all of us to do.
Back to closing reflections later on whose role it is to get it on the table and get that part right. But for now, Max, we also have a very specific question for you. And it's that how can AI leverage carbon markets and value chains and biodiversity conservation strategies in parts of the globe that are faced with digital bias and low frequency satellite data, for instance, in the tropical forest zones?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's where a lot of the carbon's at, is in the tropical zones, and working in the tropics in a remote sensing context is tough because the rainforest got some rain and some clouds, and so it makes life kind of tough. I think the important thing to realize is we don't need to be perfect on the measurement and the technology. It's totally acceptable for estimates to have a range, like a confidence interval on them. This is how statistics works. The real question is, how do we get a precision that is appropriate for the transactions that we're considering? And the other thing to realize is that many of the decisions when it comes to forest management kind of happen on an annual cadence. A year at a time, landowners are figuring out, okay, well, what's my forest management plan? What am I going to cut down this year? What am I not going to cut down? And so it actually doesn't need to be like daily monitoring necessarily. You're just trying to get inside the economic decision cycle of the people that are actually managing forest on the ground, and the communities that depend on those forests for their livelihoods. And so to me, it actually feels like a pretty manageable, although very difficult challenge to, begin to sort of get inside the economic model on a lot of this tropical forest management. But the key, I think, again, is to not just be totally narrowly focused on just carbon. We have distorted outcomes on the landscape right now because we're only looking at timber. If we only look at carbon, we're also going to get distorted outcomes. The real challenge, I think, is to figure out, well, how do we send the right price signals to landowners so that we get a balance of all of these values across the landscape? And it's tough. There's a lot of work to do.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Max. And we've been joined by Dr. Jameson, who also gave us a presentation. I hope you can hear us okay. Glad you can join us.
Yes, I can.
And actually,
thank
wonderful.
You so much.
I will actually come straight to you because there's a question from an eager participant directed at you. And they really just asked, how about underground water? Is there any way to get insights or more insights from AI about that vast world of the underground?
Oh, that's a great question. There are data sets from NASA that do look at some depth of underground water, but by and large, we need to use proxy measures that we know that, for example, forests store water, or grassland, certain type of mountain ecosystems. So part of the challenge is modeling what happens when you have forest cover loss or you have grassland conversion and how that affects water. So I think it's both. It's finding the data sets and also using AI to model what happens when you have ecosystem loss.
Wonderful. And I'll ask this question that I'd asked the panelists before. Essentially, we're trying to use tools like AI in this case, and as you said, it's proxy measurements. So essentially, we're dealing with trying to quantify some elements that are not easily quantifiable. What are your thoughts on how we square that circle, if you will? What should we do, try? What can we feasibly do, and maybe what should we not assume AI can take on?
That's a great question. That's why ground truthing is so important. When we work with countries, we are anxious to have their buy-in on AI data, on spatial data, and to say, yes, this actually is valid and this actually is not valid. So I think the first step is getting validation from country offices, from governments, from civil society. And I think the second is really testing the models and saying, we think X is, if you do X, you'll have a Y outcome, and really testing those models with AI to see, in fact, using hindcast dating, forecast data, does this model or hypothesis hold true?
Tanya Berger-Wolf. Tanya, welcome to the conversation. I will jump right in with this question directed at you, and that is, how can AI assist in monitoring and managing clean development mechanisms in countries where species are endangered just because of short-term anthropogenic interventions?
That's a great question. One of the powers of AI
is that the ability to take what humans are already doing and doing well and to scale and accelerate it. AI in and of itself is not the solution. Only in partnership with humans to help provide insight and scale and accelerate the solutions that AI can truly be helpful. So it is particularly great where the challenges are big and pressing, because then we can take what humans already do and take more data, do it faster, and apply wider.
Wonderful, thank you. Now that we have all our speakers from this session, I'll do a general round question for everybody, and I'll start with you, Bistro, on this one. How can we build international standards for biodiversity reporting that enables more interoperability and real-time status reports? Just quick fire thoughts, buzzwords that come to mind for this one.
I think, well, buzzwords, it's a key issue. I think having standards will facilitate the continued collection of data. It will make any data that we get more valuable, easier to use, and not let things slip through the cracks. And another thing is I feel like actually in a more low resource countries or areas, having standards will make the biggest difference. Because in a sense, it sets up a recipe. It sets up the framework, the expectation, and so it's a much easier thing to follow than having this kind of more vague or kind of meta goal of like, oh, we want to connect, let's say, collect biodiversity data, right? So I feel like having standards is going to increase transparency, and it's going to also increase inclusivity, because it will make it easier for participants across the world to understand what's needed, how to prepare it, and how to send it to be merged with other data sources that maybe others are collecting.
That's a really good plug for standards. Dr. Jamieson, if I may come to you with the same question, what are your thoughts about how we can build standards of an international nature?
Thank you so much, Nanjira. I think the trick is to identify selected headline indicators that are easy to measure from satellite data, from objective data. And there are three kinds. The first are the direct measurements, such as forest cover loss or forest intactness, that we can verify. The second are the indirect measures, things like protected areas and indigenous and community conserved areas, that give us a proxy about what's happening. And the third are the outcomes, and looking at, for example, what's the impact of biodiversity loss on water security, on livelihoods, on disaster risk reduction. So I think those areas can help.
Tanya, your thoughts?
I think one of the, in addition to what has already been said by Bister and Jameson, is the key point is that these standards and solutions are built in partnership with those for whom the solutions are intended, that to engender trust in the outcomes and the standards that are being developed globally, we have to make sure that everybody participates in developing the standards, and that also the capacity building that in AI specifically, in developing AI technology and understanding how different are the standards, the solutions, and the answers, and the indicators, if we bring technology and AI into it, has to be not only handed down by some government body, but has to be in partnership with those who are going to ultimately use it.
Thank you. Last but not least, Max, your thoughts?
I'll keep it quick. You know, I think with the increased cadence of measurement, you know, the ability to measure every acre every year, even at faster tempos than that, what I'd really like to see is the development of a kind of like payment for performance style system, where rather than specifying particular practices, because these systems are so complex, we say, this is what we want and we're willing to pay for it, and moving towards a model like that. So we'll see.
Indeed, we'll see. That's all the time we have for this session. Thank you so much to our speakers for this wonderful insights. Don't forget to join us for the next Q&A session on waste and pollution management. Thank you, and goodbye for now.